Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox. I'm the Compliance Ambassador for the Red Flag Group, and I'd like to welcome you to episode 20 of Compliance Into the Weeds, a podcast where Matt Kelly of Radical Compliance and I take a deep dive into a topic around compliance. Today, we take a deep dive into transaction monitoring. We take a look at the case of Wells Fargo, where the state of Arizona spiked from its lowest producing geographic region to number 2 in the entire country, and we talk about what the relationship of compliance should be when there's a sales spike. We talk about some of the different indicia and data that a compliance officer should have access to and how that might help either detect or prevent or detect any nefarious conduct and then use it to prevent it. The episode comes in at just over 20 minutes. This is Tom Fox. I'd like to thank you very much for listening to this episode of Compliance Into the Weeds. Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox. I'd like to welcome you back for another episode of Compliance Into the Weeds with my good friend and colleague, Matt Kelly. Matt, welcome.
Hello, Tom. It's good to be back.
Well, Matt, I've been really wanting to geek out a little bit, so I thought maybe we could at least start today and talk about the concept of transaction monitoring. I read a piece over the weekend that talked about a huge spike in sales at Wells Fargo in Arizona. And it turned out that that spike in sales led to a couple of, first of all, the spike in sales was from opening fraudulent accounts. But the second point was that, and what I found actually more troubling was that the people who led that effort then spread that message throughout the company. And one commentator, former Wells Fargo employee, said it spread like a cancer throughout the company of utilizing fraudulent transactions to bump up sales. But it got me thinking about a couple of things. The first is, should compliance be concerned, care, or even have visibility into a huge spike in sales? And then the second part is, how do you evaluate that from the compliance perspective? And we should probably set the stage a little bit. This was not just a non-material bump. The region, Arizona, there were 35 geographic regions in Wells Fargo's U.S. territory at that time, and Wells Fargo went from last to number 2. So I know you've thought about transaction monitoring a lot. So what would you suggest for the compliance practitioner in that situation?
Well, you're right. It is a big deal, and I think it is difficult for compliance officers to get what they need. But I liked how you described it very specifically as transaction monitoring. I know that you had your post on your blog about Wells Fargo, and it would be easy to say compliance officers need access to sales data. Well, okay, in the broadest description, sales data is revenue. That's easy to find. It's the top number on the financial reports. We're not talking about that. We're really talking about sales performance data, sales incentive data, specific numbers, and looking at transactions, the number of actual transactions regardless of the dollar amount. That can be telling. It's more about compliance officers getting visibility into what action the sales department is doing, or where are all of these activities coming from that bundle up to that top line revenue number. And that can be really challenging. On Radical Compliance, I've written about it a couple of times, looking more at what's the dashboard that compliance officers would want on their computer screen, but then how do you dive into a specific little item that you might have on your dashboard? And you need to get into where these transactions are happening, who is doing them, what are the key characteristics of the transaction. I think it is more important to get at those secondary characteristics. Who's the counterparty? Where did you sign this? When did you sign this? How close did you sign it to quarter end? What is the data on sales that are rescinded? And do they miraculously get rescinded 3 days after the quarter end and you're in another quarter? All sorts of stuff like that taken together can be more important than what's the actual dollar amount. That might not be the most material or insightful fact for compliance officers, looking at misconduct. So I think it's a very good point that you bring up.
Matt, I've heard you describe this general concept of transaction monitoring as a string or perhaps a thread that is twisted, turned, going in different directions, and that we need to figure out a way to straighten it out so that there's visibility down that line. Is that really still accurate from your perspective?
That's one good way to think about it. If you want to look at big data analytics, I think big data analytics is when you have big piles of data that are disparate from each other, but some of the data in one pile taken with some data from another pile, when you bring them together, an actual human brain would be able to look at them and say, oh yeah, so if you have 2 and 2 and you bring them together, that actually equals 4. We're very good at seeing a bigger picture once these little components are arranged together, kind of like looking at a mosaic painting. But the ability to bring those pieces together and put them together and configure them in the right way so you can see the big picture, that's the tech challenge. Another way to think of it might be data about the data. A sales transaction, at the very top of it, like I said earlier, is going to be just what's the dollar volume of the sale. That might not necessarily be terribly informative. If you're in a slow-moving business with a long sales cycle with very large purchases, $1 billion sale might not necessarily be a hugely informative thing to know about. But if you know that this comes from that new assistant sales manager who just moved to China and who is miraculously closing all these sales 2 days before the end of quarter, all of those things are much more important to know than what was the actual dollar amount, if you really want to get at questions of behavior and conduct. So there's all sorts of ways to describe it. The goal for the compliance officer is how do you get that right information? How do you pull it out there first and then configure it together?
I had a chief compliance officer at a oilfield service company once share with me that when he hears annual sales achievements that are 100, 200, 500, or 1,000% above plan, it makes him feel uneasy. But he doesn't have visibility to data other than that specific sales number. So when I ask him, well, do you have access to marketing budget? Do you have access to charitable donations that may have been made or directed by that salesman? And he confided that he didn't. And so in the FCPA world, I wonder if there's a different way to look at it, more than just the information about the data or the data about the data, by looking at other sources of information which might inform how a sales spike occurred.
I think so. And it gets to these points that you and I have talked about before. It's really tricky. You need a compliance officer who is taken seriously enough by the rest of the business that the chief marketing officer will let you see what are the marketing plans, what is the incentive, what's the budget. The HR department might show you, here are the payroll calculations for bonus. You need an IT system that gives you access to these other departments' own IT and data that they're tracking. All of that can be very difficult for compliance officers to do unless you do have that fabled seat at the table and your compliance 2.0 that we all talk about, and the empowered CCO. If you're not that, you're not going to have this access, and then you are still kind of stuck.
One of the teaching examples that I use is the Eli Lilly FCPA enforcement action from December 2012, where one of the geographic areas that Lilly got into trouble was in Poland, and they had a huge sales spike in Poland that revolved around one province in Poland, the province of Silesia. And it turned out that Lilly was making charitable donations to a legitimate charitable foundation, the Chudau Foundation, which renovated castles in Poland. It also turned out that that foundation was founded and run by the head of the Silesian Health Service, and that within 24 to 48 hours of making a donation, Lilly got a contract or a renewal. Now, these charitable donations were relatively small. I think the largest was $2,500. But over a period of years, it ran up to several $100,000. And so what I wondered is, from that experience, should you be able to make at least have visibility and even make those inquiries as a chief compliance officer beyond simply a marketing budget or something that might appear to be disconnected to a sale?
Yes. Really, misconduct comes in all forms. So at the most simple base analysis, a compliance officer is going to need to be able to ask about almost any type of data, any type of characteristic of any transaction that your company might engage in. And you and I here, I know we were talking a lot about the FCPA context. Let me give two other non-FCPA contexts to just show how difficult this can be. We all could remember several years ago, I think it was Cardinal Health. Don't hold me to that, but I'm pretty positive. They were in trouble with U.S. authorities here because doctors in Florida were prescribing an unusually high number of painkillers in a very specific region. And basically, regulators were telling Cardinal Health and CVS and other businesses, you should be aware that you have a high concentration of people prescribing opioids within like 2 or 3 zip codes. That shows us that this is a pill mill, and so we're going to hold you responsible. You should have seen that. From a certain perspective, when are pharmaceuticals now responsible for prescribing practices of physicians? Typically they had not been, but the data analytics can be done now to show that this is kind of weird. And if the regulators are saying, we can do this, company, why can't you do this? That's going to be awkward. The second context is everybody listening, Tom and I did not plan this, but just last week, I think, or the week before, Mary Jo White at the SEC, she gave a speech at New York University talking about big data analytics and how the SEC has been using big data to do its own transaction analysis of your transactions, people listening to our podcast, where the SEC was really zeroing in on insider trading. And so anybody listening to us who's in financial services, you're thinking all about due diligence, customer identity, wire transactions, and a very common form of misconduct here is stripping out some of the details of these wire transactions, known as wire stripping. And if the SEC is doing analysis of what transactions are happening when and what volumes and where are they going, if they can do this, they're going to expect that you can do this too. And we should all remember, as much as we have a lot of federal government spending, the government is still notoriously cheap and slow on the IT uptake. If they can do this at the SEC, they're really not going to believe that you can't do it because you don't have the budget or the wherewithal or something. You have more power to do it than the SEC does, and they know that too. So if they can figure it out, companies should be aware. They're going to wonder why you're not doing it.
That's really an interesting insight. Yes, I do recall the chairperson Mary Jo White's speech, but the concept that if the government can do it, they're going to expect businesses to at least have that ability, if not have implemented it, in every deferred prosecution agreement entered into in the FCPA context. In Schedule C, which is the schedule which details the compliance program that the company must implement, there is a requirement for industry and technological considerations for the compliance program, so that if an advancement is made, either in that specific industry and the company is involved or in technology, the company has to at least look at it and probably implement it. So that's a very interesting point, Matt, and I think something that really is not as discussed as much, perhaps, as it should be.
Yeah, and the SEC is never coming forward and saying you should use this vendor or do this type of transaction analysis or dump an SAP or Oracle and start using the cloud. They don't ever touch what the technology is. They're more just thinking you should be able to study the data about your transactions, period. So that really gets back to a compliance officer being able to think out what are the types of information I want, and can I then get that from my company somehow? And will the others in the company agree that you can get it? Problem number one. And then even if they say, yes, you can, but we don't have the procedures geared to create this data so we can study it. Problem number two. You're going to have to solve both of those problems. And in the future, the expectation will just be more and more great that you've done this somehow. You have this ability. And so this is a bridge compliance officers are going to have to cross.
Matt, as you know, I attempt to advocate that there are business solutions to legal problems, particularly in the compliance field. And the question I put to companies is, number one, if you have a spike in sales, wouldn't you want to know from a business reason why you had success? And number two, that if you can study that and if you can determine what led you to have that spike, perhaps you could replicate that in some other area of your company, or at least put the policies and procedures or internal controls in place which allowed you to do so. And that's one of the reasons that I continually advocate that more compliance actually means more robust financial controls, which allows you to run your company more efficiently. So when I put it to companies, why wouldn't you want to know that information? Then they tend to understand it.
Yeah. And, I would even also say that the analog to this is when you look at the new ERM framework that's been proposed by COSO, when they jettisoned risk tolerance and replaced it with acceptable variation on a performance goal. Look, we all get that the negative variation, you're under your goal, that's going to be a problem. And there's all sorts of immediate risks there that, you might not have any money. But part of what COSO did there was to remind people that if you consistently are exceeding your performance goal, like why? To your point, Tom, there, if you're doing it once, maybe if it's legitimate, shouldn't you be doing this every quarter? It'd be good to know. But, you're looking for patterns, and a pattern of consistent over exceeding of your performance goal. If this is too good to be true, we all know that many times it is, and you want to get to it. But the tools and the concepts are out there.
Well, Matt, this has been a great discussion. This is Tom Fox with Matt Kelly. Matt blogs at Radical Compliance. You should check out his site. He really does a lot of thinking around not only transaction monitoring, but also the SEC, financial issues, and a wide variety of topics in compliance. So, Matt, thank you very much.
Thank you, Tom.